Okay, and welcome to Blind Advocate. It's really cold here today where I'm in Armidale, New South Wales. It's currently 4.9 degrees Celsius with a wind chill factor of -6 degrees Celsius. So it's really cold. And our reverse cycle heater blew a few weeks ago. So we have no heating in the house. So I'm actually quite cold. Um, just going on from last week with the NDIS, there's a couple of other things I'd like to talk about. Just going on from last week with the NDIS, there's a couple of other things I'd like to talk about. I can hear myself leaking. That's right now. Yeah, so I want to talk about privacy and confidentiality with the NDIS. Now, prior to the NDIS, I'm going to talk about myself here, use myself as an example. Um, Prior to the NDIS, it was only myself and my doctor knew 100% of my issues. My wife knows about 95%. She doesn't know everything. Um, some of it's a bit personal and I don't like talking about it. Uh, but to get on the NDIS, I had to tell them everything of my personal care, what I use, how I use it, and why I use it. And I thought that was a huge breach. And they told me if I didn't give them that information, I couldn't get on the NDIS. Now, that's my personal private information. That's nobody else's business but mine. And I don't think people should be extorted or blackmailed to give up personal care information to get on the NDIS. Your doctor should just have to write a note saying he needs approximately X amount per year for personal care. Everybody else doesn't need to know about it. So the initial meeting I had with the NDIS, there were two LACs, a person from the NDIS, myself, and an advocate. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Then they started getting into personal stuff and said, I really don't want to talk about it. It's personal. Talking about it in front of strangers is humiliating. It's degrading. I don't want to do it. And I was told, you don't give us the information, you don't get on the NDIS. I call bullshit. That's extortion and blackmail. That should be my privacy. My right to my privacy is an absolute right. Nobody's got the right to force me to give up that information, which I had to do. Now, over the next 18 months, like I said previously, I had 6 different LACs, so they all had access to that information. Then after a year of not having an LAC because I refused to have one, I was talked into having one more. So the first few years, I had 7 LACs, 7, who had access to all my information, all of it, the personal care stuff. They had no right to know it. Nobody's got the right to know it. It's my personal private information. It's humiliating, degrading for me personally. I don't talk about it. And I shouldn't be forced to talk about it. It's not right. Now, the NDIA might want to say, if you don't give us the information, we can't give you the funding. Well, if I get a letter from my doctor and they say I would need X amount per year for personal care, that should be enough coming from my doctor. I shouldn't have to list everything out, give personal private details on why I need it, how I use it, and how often I use it. And if anybody thinks that's acceptable, that's your opinion. This is my opinion. I was forced, extorted, and blackmailed to give that information up. Now, the LACs that were contracted with the NDIS are no longer there. They have another company. They have 6 LACs that can access my file if they need to, plus my coordinator support, which I trust, but I still don't want her to know my personal private information. So why are we forced to give up our right to privacy? It's protected by law. It's protected by the United Nations. But because we have disabilities, we're forced to give it up. Who else has got access to that information? Anyone in the NDIA? Now, I know they have strict rules, policies, and procedures to prevent leaks of confidentiality and privacy. But the nature of people is that they talk, they gossip. I talk and gossip. So what's to stop them doing it? Oh, I can tell you this, but promise you don't tell anyone else. How often does that happen? So how many people now have access that I know of, have access to that information? So originally there was 4, then the other LACs, which takes it to 11, the coordinator of support, which is 12, that I know of, that I don't want them to have that information. That's my right to withhold that information. I should not be forced to give it up. Anyone who doesn't want to give that information up should not be forced. It's wrong. The NDIA need to address it. If people want to give that information up, that's their decision. They make that informed decision themselves. But to be forced, to be blackmailed, no, not on, not with me. Now, I had a service provider and we're talking about my plan, and she pulled it out, and they had, oh yeah, you got X amount for independent living skills, X amount for this, and X amount for personal care. And I just turned around and looked at this person and I said, how do you have that information that I have X amount for personal care? She said, oh, it's on your file. I said, what else is on it? She said, no, that's it. It just has how much you have in each category. So I contacted my coordinator of support and I said, look, I don't want anyone having access to that file. If they want to know if I have funding, I'll get them to contact you and you can say, yes, there's enough funding there, you're authorised, go ahead, send the invoices. So now I find out all these service providers, although it might not go into detail, I don't want people knowing I have a personal care costing. Whose businesses is that? And the only reason I'm talking about it now is it needs to be raised, it needs to be spoken about. It's wrong. Like I said, I spoke to my coordinator of support and I said, if any service provider or any organisation wants access to my file to see what funding I have available, just tell them there's enough money. I don't want them having that file, that funding amount, those categories. So she's doing that, and I really do appreciate that. I'm now starting to regain some of my privacy and confidentiality, but I just thought I'd raise that for other people who may feel like I do, that they shouldn't be forced to give up that information just to get funding from the NDIS. It's not right. It's wrong. It's against the law. Force someone to give up their privacy. We have privacy as a right in this country, and to give that up because of the NDIS funding, it's wrong. And to force someone to do it by extortion and blackmail, oh, if you don't give us the information, you don't get funding. That's extortion. That's blackmail. That's my opinion. I'm not happy about it, and the NDIA need to look at that and change it. And the people on the clients of the NDIS need to take more power back into their hands, take it away from the NDIA. Speak up. And if you can't do it yourself, you need help, reach out to a support worker or an advocacy organisation. So that's my little blurb for the day. I had to get that off my chest. It's been irritating me for years, that issue. So if there's anybody else out there finding themselves in the same situation, please let me know. Send me an email at blindadvocate007@gmail.com. All right, so we'll just move on to the next one. And the NDIS and the over 65, should they have access to the NDIS? Now, I don't know too much about this. I've seen it on the emailing list that Adam has. I've read a little bit. I think that if somebody has an accident and they're over 65, I think they should have access to the NDIS. But then you start going into people getting older and they have health issues like a stroke or a heart attack or something like that. Does that then entitle them to get on the NDIS? I don't know. What do you think, Chris?
Look, I think there's a like in a lot of cases, I think that there's justification for having people have access to the NDIS, because I know that their needs can be quite unique, and that the aged care system doesn't seem to cater for that. I know my wife had motor neuron disease, and I was quite involved in the Motor Neuron Disease Association and support groups. And I found a very strange situation. We had some people who had motor neuron disease who were a bit older, and then they ended up reaching a point where they needed to, where they switched over to the aged care system because of their age, and then suddenly the levels and the amount of support changed dramatically, and usually for the worse, because their needs weren't being independently catered for. So I think in those sorts of situations, I mean, it's crazy that when someone reaches the age of 65, so their needs are actually increasing, because as they get older, then they have the usual concerns that older people might have, but the level of support and care that they have is actually being reduced. And they often, it's the case as well, where the primary carer is often their spouse, and they're getting older as well. So they reach a certain age, and then suddenly, the proverbial rug gets pulled out from underneath them. And I don't see how that's fair and equitable, basically. So look, I know that there's a limited pool of money, and I think that as people get older, as well, and they need support. I mean, maybe if the government can't afford to have everyone who's getting older who has sort of age-related mobility issues, say for example, that they can't go under the NDIS because of funding, but maybe it just needs to be done differently. I don't know what the solution is there.
Yeah, look, we all know that people over 65 on the age pension are living below the poverty line. And for someone who's worked their whole life, paid their taxes their whole life, they should have a basic standard of living that's above the poverty line. They should have access to health care, at a nominal rate, if not free of charge. They've paid their way through life. They've worked hard their whole life. They've paid their taxes. In some cases, they've gone to war, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam. They've earned that right.
Yeah, well, this is exactly right. As if someone's been, why does someone not deserve the same level of support when they're older as they do when they're younger? If they've got if they've got something that's meant that they're not able to do what they were able to do before.
Look, and that's look. Everybody has a right to health. There's a couple of things in this country. The amount of taxes we pay, and those buff-headed idiots in Canberra who are overpaid, in my opinion. We should have free healthcare in this country, like it used to be in the late 70s and the early 80s with Medicare, and free education. We're going to end up living like the Americans do, go to hospital, pay $25 for one aspiro. I don't want to go down that track. I really don't. But people over 65, they've worked their whole life. They've paid their way. They should expect something in return. They built this country. We sit on their shoulders. They've earned that right. They should have health care. They should be living above the poverty line. They shouldn't be forced to go to soup kitchens, to the Salvation Army for not free food, to go to organisations for donations to pay for electricity. It's just, yeah, it's just not on. And if they need help, just give it to them.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I've heard time and time again that there are people who maybe they need to have an operation. They're older, they're on a pension, and if it's voluntary, then it's not covered under Medicare. It was considered voluntary, but it might be something like they've got they need knee reconstruction. Now, if they don't have that, then they've lost all the mobility. They're older, so it makes it very, very difficult for them to get around. And then it's almost like a charity system where the surgeon might donate their time and services, the hospital might donate their time and services, the anaesthetist might donate their time and services, but it's almost like you're sort of approaching them cap in hand, saying to them, oh, please, can I have this essential services? And there's a lot of people who get these things, but if it's happening, in an unofficial way, almost under the table, whereas these people, medical practitioners who are doing it on a voluntary basis anyway, then why isn't there another way that it can be done more officially, sort of over the table as part of the healthcare system?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think people over 65 should have access to the NDIS. Just because you get older doesn't mean. I fell Father's Day last year. I fell in the shower, um, broke my left hip, the neck of the femoral head. Went to hospital, had a rod put in, a couple of screws. I'm 58. That happened when I was 57. And I can see someone in their 70s or 80s falling over, going through the same thing, how painful it is. It's excruciating, the pain, but the level of service that they need afterwards. I had physios come into my home because I couldn't travel, doing exercises to strengthen my hip and get the mobility movement going. I don't like hospitals. I've never liked them. I'm known up here where I live, I'm called a runner. I just run out of hospital. I can't stand them. But the level of service that's needed after those sort of falls or accidents for people who are older are higher, and those needs, they have to be met. And it can't be met through the aged care, so it has to be met through the NDIS. And like Chris said, there's limited funding. But what do we do? Do we just keep ignoring it? No, no, it needs to be talked about. If anybody out there has more information on this, just pop up and come and talk to us, or send us an email. Yeah, it's an important issue and it needs to be discussed. So I just, yeah, I don't know. Have you got anything else to say about it, Chris? Or
Look, I think the yeah, I mean, I think ideally you want to have it so you've got a universal level of support for everyone across all boundaries. Um, I think government's overall approach to funding could be done quite differently. Where I think also certainly a lot of people who work within the disability support sphere, they sort of acknowledge that everyone is on that spectrum to some degree. And you have all sorts of different people who need different levels of support, people who have got, might have a long-term disability that need consistency of care, and they need certainty about that their needs are going to be met. But you also have people when they're older, they need support. When they're younger, they need support. There are people who need temporary support, having disabilities. There's really everyone's just on a continuum. And you should be treating everyone on that continuum as being a person, first and foremost, showing them a large amount of respect, not being patronizing or paternalistic. And I think that there should be a level of equality across the board, because everyone's just on a spectrum. We draw a line at the age of 65 as saying, well, now that's an old person. Even the rate that people age at is, greatly varies. And I think there should be a solution, which is just sort of more universal, looking at things on a needs basis rather than putting things in boxes to be able to sort of, divide them and chop them up and use it as an excuse for giving one person support and not another person support. I think that government in particular, tends to silo things and naturally work that way. But I don't think that that's fair and equitable. Well, it's clearly not.
well, I seen a story on the current affair. It was on a couple of weeks ago. A woman and her husband went on holidays, and they did got on a Segway to tour around the place they were visiting, and she'd actually fallen off and broken neck and ended up a quadriplegic. Now, she was on the NDIS for a period of time, and then she sued the company that the tour was with, and she was awarded, I don't know, she got herself, I think it was about 1.4 million. The lawyer got about the same. I think it's one of those compensation lawyers, I think. And the NDIS had come back and said, um, because you got that payout, now we want that $750,000 to be spent on you while you're on the NDIS back, because you got that payout. Yeah, I think, yeah, and any smart lawyer would have told the woman to go and investigate what would happen with the NDIS if she sued and won. What would happen with that money? Because I think that woman, she ended up paying off the mortgage that she had in the house. Then she bought another house that met her needs more suitably. Being a quadriplegic, she got a good quality electric chair. I don't know what she's going to do now. She's appealing the decision to pay the NDIA back 750,000. Like I said, the lawyer, if he was a decent lawyer, he sort of said to the woman, investigate what's going to happen with the NDIS, because as far as I'm aware, I had a really good friend who was in a car accident, ended up a quadriplegic. He got paid out. I don't know exactly how much. Sorry, how much it was, but that was to pay for his supports for the rest of his life. Um, and he passed away in like 2000 or 2001, because he got worse and he didn't want to be kept alive in a respirator, so they took him off it, and he just passed away by his own choice. That's a different story. But what happens in those situations where somebody gets hurt, they go on the NDIS, then they decide to sue, get paid out X amount, because they've got to pay for, supposedly use that money for supports. Should they pay back the NDIA that money that they spent on supporting that person previously? That's a good question. I think, yeah, I feel sorry for the woman, I truly do, but if that was me, I would have done a bit more investigation on it. It's a really bad and sad situation that she's in. Hope everything works out for her, but yeah, a little bit of research beforehand would have been good.
It is hard though, Jeff, if you've got, like, you can only research what you know that you might want to research. I mean, I wouldn't have thought, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't have researched it because I wouldn't have had the expectation that that would have been the case. I would have thought that once the case is finalised and if I got a compensation payout, then I might no longer meet the requirements in terms of an asset analysis to be on the NDIA from then on. I mean, this is the problem with a lot of things in the legal system is that whether you knew something was illegal or not, if you did something that was illegal, then you're still in trouble. It's the same sort of thing in this situation where if you, like, it probably would have been good to do due diligence. I think that really it's the lawyers who are at fault because they probably dealt with a lot of these kinds of cases, would have known that that would have been the case afterwards. But if you had, I mean, say if you had a win in a compensation case and you had enough money that you could be self-funded and supporting yourself. Now, if you had to back payment, say it might take so long to go through the court system, and if it was a big payout, it might be 10 years going through the court system. Now, if you have to pay back all the supports you've required over that period of time, then you would no longer have the amount of money that the court has given you to be supported and self-funding, because a lot of that would have been whittled away. If you had, I don't know, if you had $5 million and you were getting a couple of $100,000 a year to help support yourself, if you're a quadriplegic or a paraplegic, you might need that just in being able to provide for supports. But if you then have over 10 years, you might have someone with a budget of a couple of $100,000. Suddenly it's like that's $2 million out of your $5 that immediately gets taken away paying back for the services that you've already received. During that period of time, you didn't have the assets base. Like, you met the requirements to get the NDIA funding because you didn't have the assets base at that point in time. It's a bit crazy that it's retrospective that they then just go back and say, well, now that you have the money, you have to pay back the money that you didn't have before. Because then someone will be in the case where they can no longer support themselves in the long term. That money will just get whittled down and they'll end up back on the NDIA anyway, on the NDIS.
Yeah, look, it's a conundrum. I know, people who are sued, and they've got money for supports, plus, for personal damage, personal loss, like being confined to a wheelchair. You couldn't put a price on it, but insurance companies do because that's what they do. But to follow the NDIA's idea on it, where do they draw the line? Do they say to someone who's gotten X amount for the next 20 years, then you've got to use all that money before you get on the NDIS? I just don't know, especially in this woman's situation. I think it was reckless of the lawyer. He should have advised that woman to research it. I would have researched it anyway myself, because I've known people who have gone through the court system for damages that way. I just don't know why. Now, like, out of the money she got awarded, she's basically got nothing left after she bought that new house that's more suitable, more accessible. She's still got the previous house, I think. I think she'll have to sell that previous house to pay back the NDIA. It's a sad situation, but should the NDIA tell these people who have an accident like that, if you sue, then you're going to have to pay back all the support costs up to this point. Does the NDIA have to do that? Is it their obligation?
I think it's important they disclose that. I don't know if they do or they don't, but it should be fairly open that if that's going to be the case. I mean, maybe that's one of the questions they should say when you're putting in the application is, are you anticipating that there'll be a court case in relationship to how you've obtained the disability, so that then they can give you some information or have information that's freely available. There's not I understand that the NDIA is trying to recoup money. I understand that the NDIA is concerned about their own budget that is continually increasing. They want to make sure that they can provide adequate services to people that really need it. But it doesn't seem, I don't know, it needs to be done in a fair and consistent way, is how they're doing it, and on a needs basis, and not unfairly disadvantaging one person over another. But if you're in her situation though, and you found out that you were going to have to pay that money back, what do you do? Does that mean that you don't sue the person if someone's responsible for the situation that you're in? Does that mean that you don't sue them because you know that the money that you're going to get is just going to go to the NDIA to pay back some of the services that you've already received anyway? But it's a big risk there because, yeah, I guess and is that based on how much you get paid before you pay the lawyers or afterwards? Because you could end up, if it's before the lawyers get paid in that situation, then you could end up being in a lot of trouble. If you got $1.5 million and the lawyers got $1.5 million, but you'd received over that period of time $2 million worth of funding, then you could find yourself in a situation where you owe the government money. So this is why it just shouldn't work that way, because there's too much uncertainty. It makes it very difficult.
Yeah, look, it's. I think this is probably the first case of this sort of thing that I've heard of. I really feel sorry for the woman. She's had a huge loss becoming a quad, had a very, very tiny amount of small gain and getting that compensation payout, then basically losing it, paying it back to the NDIA. Now, I know the NDIA was established to help people with disabilities who can't afford the basic items that they need to be independent and get back into the community. And that's the original goal of the NDIS, is to give people with disabilities the supports that they need to get back into the community, or to be independent, or help them do daily tasks that they can't do. I just don't know. I just feel sorry for that woman. She's just going from bad to worse all the time. She's just, exceptionally bad luck. It's a sad story.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing that you raise about what the purpose of the NDIS is for. I think we've talked privately about this on a few occasions, where you say, well, some people are getting their basic needs met so that they can get out of bed in the morning and they can, shower and go to the bathroom and have be able to get groceries into their house and cook a meal. For other people, it's about being able to achieve things that they haven't been able to do, but they're maybe more aspirations about, their hopes and dreams. They've wanted to study, or they've really, sometimes it's about trips to places and experiences that they haven't had before. But it sort of seems, that in itself is sort of quite interesting when you think about it, is that the the person who needs to have their basic needs met under the NDIA, they also want to have their, some level of their hopes and dreams being met and having some experiences out of their usual experiences. So, it must be very hard for the people who are trying to write policies on these things as to how you establish who gets money and how much money they get. And I know at the moment the Albanese government, they're saying that they're trying to make the NDIA more sustainable in the long run by making it so that there's reducing corruption within the system, which I think everyone's heard about. Various stories where people have been rorting the system and getting things that they shouldn't have been, organised crime getting into it, which is never going to be a good thing. But possibly also those people who are being, that have, I would imagine they'd be getting into trying to balance out the needs of different individuals so that there's more equity across all the range of the customers. But the question is that how do you do that? How do you, you can't compare one person to another because everyone's experience is different. Everyone's needs are different. It's a very challenging thing to do. I'm not sure, where do you draw the line?
I think, when the NDIS was first come into fruition and they put out little test areas, I think the then government, which was the Labor government, and like I said, I love now I love the NDIS. It's been a great asset for me. It's the greatest thing that people with disabilities have got in this country for decades. But I think it was rushed out because the government was totally unaware of how much people with disabilities didn't do because they didn't have enough money to fund it themselves. If their families couldn't help fund it, they went without. That was just the nature. And like I said before, before the NDIS, I'd watch a bit of TV, get on the computer, go back to the TV, go back to the computer. That was my life in like 30 odd years. But the government's drastically underestimated how much funding would be really needed to support people with disabilities. Because people with disabilities traditionally relied on either institutions or family. They stay with families for the parents' lives. And if they have siblings, then they go to a sibling or they go to an institution. That's the way it's always been. Now, we'll go back, hundreds and hundreds of years. If a child was born with a disability that was just left out in the open to die, then we come into putting people with disabilities, doesn't matter what disability they had, put them in institutions. And that was going on for hundreds of years as well. I mean, there was a movie that came out, I think it was the early 80s, the movie was called Annie's Coming Out. It's a true story. Fantastic movie. I recommend if you can get your hands on it to watch it. Now, we went from institutions to getting into group homes or living with your families, and now with the NDIS, we're all trying to get back out, not trying to get back out to the community, but trying to get into the community and its activities with the help with the support workers and the NDIS. The government drastically underestimated how much people with disabilities and their families went without for decades, for lifetimes. And I think that's the problem. It's a great idea, the NDIS, but I think it wasn't investigated properly. They just rushed it out, and they tried to fix it as they went along. I was continually told, I was like flying a plane while you're trying to build it. Now, that's great for the pilots, but what about the passengers?
I heard that repeatedly as well, and I've got to say, this is when my wife was needing support. We were supposed to go straight onto the NDIA, and it took us, I think it was a solid 8 months, 9 months, where we just had nothing, and I had to provide 100% of the support. And they kept on saying, "Oh, look, it's not our fault. We're trying to build the plane while we're trying to fly it." And you go, "Well, I'm sorry. It's a cute thing to say. It's not good enough. It's not good enough for like realizing they've got essential services. They've got people who rely on these, and they did prioritize people, but it still took a lot of people months and months and months and months to get through. And they say, and this is not just for people going and doing group activities in a park. And I'm not trying to put that down in any way, because for a lot of people, that's the social interaction they get, and having social interaction with people and being in a safe environment is so important for people with disabilities. But when you've got even people with basic needs not being met, when I heard that from them, I was furious. I couldn't, it's a kind of a quirky thing to say on their behalf. They shouldn't be saying it. It's inappropriate. It's not right. And I think it's part of that perpetuation of a very paternalistic way of looking at supporting people with disabilities. I think it goes back to what you were saying a second ago about back in ye olden days, where people were with disabilities, if they were being supported, then it was a charity. It was something that if they weren't showing that they were eternally grateful for not being left out on the hillside to starve, that they need to be continually showing that they are happy for all the charity that people are donating to them. And there's sort of almost residuals of that kind of thing through in the system today. It's slowly changing, and I know all the people that a lot of the people I've had contact with have treated as being people are people, and treated a very egalitarian way. But there's still that element of it, and I find sometimes when you're dealing with the NDIA, I think you've probably come across situations like that as well, where they're just like, they just have no perspective on where people are coming from, what they're trying to achieve, and why they're trying to achieve it. It sort of needs to be more understanding. I think the more that people can get out there and spend time with other people who a whole range of people who have disabilities, and realizing that they're just people, then the more the system's going to work. I mean, you've had experiences with people in the NDIA. I've had experiences with the NDIA where there's people who are working on giving assessments and trying to work out what level of funding and support someone needs, who don't have any friends with disabilities, they don't have any family members with disabilities, and they have never been on a work site where people are being supported with disabilities at all. And it just means that you're just lacking that perspective.
That's you read that. Yeah, sorry, my doorbell just rang, so Chris is just going to answer it. But Chris is right, and we all know this to be a fact because we've all experienced it. But trying to get out on the NDIS and back into the community and into the community activities, that's what the NDIS was designed to do. But where do we draw the line? Does the government keep funding this, or do they try and find ways of, I don't know, stop wasted money? I tell the NDIA I need something, then I need to get an OT report, and they get paid like $173 an hour. Then they refer it off to a physio. Then they get paid $173 an hour, and they charge 8, 10, 12 hours for doing the assessment and writing the report. And they said the exact same thing that I said. I don't understand it. Why are we double dipping or triple dipping? I just don't understand.
I agree. And when you want to look at cost savings as well, all of this, like being overly procedural, And I understand NDIS trying to make sure they're not unnecessarily spending money, but at times we had very detailed report from the occupational therapist, very detailed report from the physiotherapist, very detailed report from the GP and from the specialist in Sydney. And we put that all in, and they're like, "Oh, we need to look into this further. Do you have any further evidence?" And you're like, "What? I don't know what that means. What further evidence? Like, um, you've got all of these professionals who spent all of this time, and a lot of it's on a voluntary basis as well. This is the thing that really surprised me with sort of entering into the disability support sphere through my wife, was that so much of it is still being run by people who are going above and beyond the call of duty and donating their time to be able to make basic services work. And it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like that. It should all be above board. It should all be registered. People should be paid for the time that they're putting in. But if you want to save time and money, make it so it's streamlined. I mean, make it very clear that, sure, you need to have things that are evidence-based. Be very clear about the amount of evidence that you need. And if you provided that evidence, then go with it, rather than, like I think about all of those reviews and the hours and hours of tedious conversations with the NDIA workers. Everyone's, all the government workers in that sphere are all getting paid. It's a waste of time and money. And clearly there's evidence that whatever it is that is being discussed is needed.
Look, I think if the government wants to save a lot of money, I think they need to listen to the people on the ground, listen to the clients on the NDIS, listen to their support workers who are supporting them, listen to their bosses. I use a REMA as providing my supports. They're fantastic, all the way up from the management down to the support workers. I can't fault them. They've been professional from the very start. I told them before I signed up, and I said, "Look, with my health and my disabilities, I could phone you 5 minutes before my time session starts, and I can't make it because I'm not well." And they said, "Oh, yeah, no, look, we understand, that's fine." And that's happened quite a few times. My previous provider, I told them the same thing. They ended up dumping me without any notice. I didn't, according to their own policies, there was no arbitration to resolve the issues. There was no discussions. I didn't get 2 weeks' notice. I was just told on the day we're no longer providing services. So, that's not on, but some services are good, some services should be eliminated, such as my previous providers. That the support staff were good. It's just the management was just pathetic. If the government wants to save money, just listen to the ground staff, listen to the people, listen to the clients, listen to the people who are supporting them. That's where you get all the information that you need. That's where you get the information for your policies and procedures. That's where you do it, from the ground, not the top down, paying big money to people who have nothing to do with it. It's not on. But
yeah, you have some crazy situations too. Like, I think in one area is, I know that there's agencies that provide employment for people with disabilities. I think that's an area that really needs to be heavily looked into, where you've got organisations that are sort of double dipping, because they're saying that, okay, we're providing employment for people, they're getting paid cents in the dollar. Cents in the dollar might even be generous, and then they're also getting funding because they're, in theory, providing support for the people that are working in the organisation, but then seem to have, sometimes a relatively low duty of care. So I think that's probably a sector that could be looked at. I mean, I don't know why in that situation, if you've got a business that's paying people very little money to employ people with disabilities to do basic labouring work, why they're also then getting support money from the government on top of that. It sort of seems like a crazy situation. I don't know exactly what each person's personal situations are, but it seems like that would be an area that would be an easy one to have a look at. So yeah.
What you're trying to say is that um, a business that employs people with disabilities pays them very little, but they're also getting paid as support workers. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I think that they must be. I mean, I don't. I haven't worked in the field, but this is sort of what I've heard through a lot of other people who have worked in that area and saying this was happening. So people were being paid almost as support workers, while at the same time the agency is getting paid to do. I mean, say gardening work is a classic example. You've got a team of 15 people with disabilities out working in the field, pulling out weeds, mowing lawns, getting paid good market rates for doing so, paying their own people very little money, but then the supervisors who they're supervising the people with disabilities are getting funding from the NDIA because they're acting as supervisors. I mean, that kind of thing seems like it's double dipping to me. I think that there are plenty of support and service agencies out there who aren't double dipping, who are getting justifiably they're spending their time doing work. There's a lot of agencies that have been doing the right thing that I think have been driven into the ground. Who just said we just can't provide services anymore because we can't manage the bureaucracy of the NDIA as well as providing services. It's just too hard. Where there are other organisations that seem to be thriving. You do need to ask the question, I guess. The ones that are thriving, are they doing things better, or are they finding ways of jumping through hoops with the bureaucracy so they're getting more money out of the government? Yeah, I don't know. What are your experiences with that, Jeff?
I know the organisation that you're referring to. They're a closed-off little community. I don't want to say too much on that, but I know that every time a support worker does a shift, they then have to spend, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes writing up a report as well. So, and these support workers, they do that paperwork in their own time because they've got to go from one shift to another shift to another shift, or from one person to another person to another person in one day. They don't have time to sit there and write notes. So they do that at home in their own time. And to me, that's great. I appreciate that. But it also causes burnout for really good support workers. They get burnt out doing all this really hard work assisting people with disabilities, then having to go home and spend hours in their own time. I'm not just talking about the support workers that I have. I'm talking about other service organisations like Guide Dogs or Vision Australia. The staff do a home visit, then they've got to rush off, and because in regional areas, they may have to cover an area that's 1,000 kilometres in a few days. So they rush from one person to another person to another person. Then they go back to their motel and they sit there for hours doing the paperwork. That causes burnout and we lose good people. The people with disabilities lose good people because of that burnout and that frustration that these people have with the NDIA and having to do all this paperwork and prove that they're doing all the stuff that they're doing with the clients. It causes burnout. And I've seen so many people leave over the last few years, different organisations, because of the NDIS, because they have to do X amount, they have to prove all the times that they spent, they have to write up reports, and they do that in their own time, and that's not fair. It's not fair. When you get, people, organisations, who get paid good money, big money, to help run the organisation, and these poor people on the ground having to use their own time to do the work they don't have the time to do during the day. It's not on.
And this seems to be it's an interesting thing though, because what we've been talking about is kind of two sides of the same coin. I mean, on one hand, you having that accountability and having that collating that evidence means that you can show that you are doing the right thing by customers and you're providing an adequate level of support. If you provide 2 hours of support, you should be there for 2 hours, and if you weren't, then you need to justify why. But it's interesting that on one level there are the organisations that are jumping through the hoops, doing all the right things, but then there are other organisations that aren't. I mean, I sort of wonder what are they providing evidence of what they're doing? Are they doing the right thing or not doing the right thing? There's independent workers. So there's independent workers I know who are fantastic and definitely do the right thing and spend a lot of time making sure that they're documenting what they're doing. There are other ones that are completely doing the wrong thing, and they might be being a personal at-home support worker while then taking on other customers and then doing sort of, rather than having a structured way of working, they just kind of just continually taking on more and more people, and each one they're getting paid for it. There's been a few cases that I've heard of, some of which they have been pulled up on it, but I'm sure there are ones out there where they haven't been as well. It's good to have that documentation because it helps to prevent that kind of corruption that we're talking about. But then if the documentation becomes such a task within itself, and it's the bureaucracy that means that the goods businesses are struggling to survive, then there's got to be another solution, another way of doing it that's going to work for everyone.
Look, I think that the government should be auditing service organisations. I lodged a complaint against Bright Sky, who used to be Paraquat, who are now Forwardability, with the NDIS Complaints Commission twice for the same issue. And I spoke to one of the people on the telephone who answers the phone, and I said, "What's going on there? Are you getting too big? Are you got too many clients and not enough staff? You haven't got the infrastructure?" And they said, "Well, yeah." And I'm not the only one that laid complaints against this organisation. So why isn't the government going in and auditing that organisation and fining them for doing the wrong thing? And my previous providers, they brought on way too many clients and they didn't have enough staff. Why is that not being audited by the government? I don't understand it. It's just crazy. The whole system, it needs to be overhauled from the top down. I don't think the support workers and some of the service organisations are absolutely fantastic. They're jumping through all the hoops that an NDIA require. Other organisations don't seem to be doing it and getting away with it. I just don't understand why those organisations aren't being audited by the government.
Yeah, and I think this is right. Is that when you've got auditing systems at the moment are largely paper-based, from what I understand, where you have an audit team will come with a lot of due notice beforehand, and everyone's going to make sure that their paperwork is all up to tick. But I think this is only with the only ones that get audited are a certain type of organisation. There are even support agencies out there that, because they haven't registered in the same way that other ones have, then they don't get audited. And it's just like, how does that work? Why aren't they having, like you say, a surprise surprise auditor who turns up on the spot and says, right, I want to turn up on one of your support sessions and just check to see things are okay. You want to have a system where people with the person with disabilities, the customer, can put in a complaint with complete impunity, because I know that with the with the Royal Commission recently, that there are people out there who've had things happen to them which are completely unjust, and they haven't made complaints because you've got to understand that for a lot of people with disabilities, they've been treated as a second-class citizen most of their life. They've been treated in a way where, in situations where there's a person of authority, they've said, look, if you make a complaint, then I will make you pay for it. And so whether that's ended up happening or not is another question. But they're fearful of sticking their neck out and making a complaint, and worried that it's going to come back and burn them. And especially when you're dealing with people, as we are in a small country town, but also in the cities, then it's a tight knit community amongst the disability support people. They're quite justifiably fearful of that. So if you have it, you need to be taking this into account when you're setting up a system where you can be taking complaints from people that are properly investigated. And I think having a spot check system where you just have people turn up in support sessions, or you have people turn up at organisations and say, right, what's happening? Who are the people you're working with? Going and interviewing some of the customers and saying to them, so what do you do on support sessions? Making sure that they are getting properly supported and not just being babysit. Make sure that the ratios of support workers to customers is appropriate. And like you were saying, Jeff, that there are people who are just taking on more than they can handle and not providing the supports that they promised. Often, people with disabilities are often very vulnerable. You've got people with intellectual disabilities who can't really make an assessment. They have no benchmark to work against as to whether they're getting the same thing or an adequate level of support. So this needs to be taken into account in the whole checks and balances system. And it needs to be something other than some people who are just going to go through and check that you've done all your paperwork, because that's not a good measure of whether people are providing good supports or not.
Well, you do raise a good point there, Chris. I heard of a story where there was a young lady with an intellectual disability who was sexually abused, and the person from the NDIS come, who was a male, whose first language was not English, so he was very hard to understand, and he was asking personal private information to this young lady. Luckily, she had a good support worker with her at the time. That sort of interaction, she should have had a female person from the NDIA go to this young lady, especially if they knew she's been sexually abused in the past. Why send a male? I think a female should have been sent. So these checks and balances, yeah, they don't seem to weigh out. They seem to weigh out on one side and not the other. I just sometimes it's really hard for me to follow and understand why the NDIA do things. They have certain goals that they need to aim for. Was it KPIs, key points of interest, or something like that? Look, the NDIS, like I said, it's great, but it's got a lot of repairs that need to be done, and I think the best way to do that is talk to the clients, talk to the on-ground staff, not rely on senior management like regional managers and their managers and all the way up to the federal government.
Yeah, if you had a group um, of the KPI ninjas with the NDIA who were sort of almost independent of the NDIA as well, who could jump in and not just be assessing whether service providers are doing the right thing, but they could jump in and do those spot checks. I think that in itself would be a massive deterrent for a lot of people, because if you had someone jumping in and saying, "Well, I've got down here that you're on a support shift with Joe Blogs," where's Joe Blogs? Where's the support worker? Where's the basic thing of having turned up? I know there was a case of people committing complete and utter fraud. I think it was down on the coast somewhere where they had this group of people that included doctors who were saying that people who didn't have disabilities had disabilities, and the people who were supposed to be providing supports weren't actually providing supports, had never received any supports, but that was okay because they didn't have disabilities, and there was someone in the background who was getting money hand over fist from every which direction. When that sort of thing should never happen. You should have it so that you have your KPI ninjas who jump in and investigate these things at no notice, just to keep people honest. I mean, maybe giving people a bit of latitude, because people have their strong days and their weaker days when they're doing anything, but at least you're getting some sort of a measure of what's actually happening on the ground out there. But if they not only investigated what was happening in support workers, but also within the NDIA itself, so that they had independent review systems, so that they're looking at or could follow up on if a customer had a bad experience with the NDIA itself. If you look at the NDIA as a service provider for their customers, they are the ones who are not only regulating the industry but also providing the services. This goes back to, I think, on the previous podcast I mentioned, I thought it would have been a great idea for the NDIA is to have the NDIA at a federal level being the regulator, and they could have had their KPI ninjas coming in and inspecting, making sure everyone's okay, and then actually at a state level of having those people be in the job of actually handing out the funding to people on the ground might have been a better way to structure it. And then you would also have that differentiation where you've got the federal people who are regulating the state who are doing the service delivery. We don't have that, but maybe we need an independent regulator, like an independence team that can actually assess that the NDIA is doing the right thing, as well as the service providers and the customers, that would then mean you can have a more streamlined system and waste less money. So there'd be more money in the bucket for spending it on the right things.
So, yeah, but I agree. We need to have independent auditors to audit everyone. But where do we get them from? I mean, the federal government's always going to apply pressure on those auditors to bow and scrape to what they want and not be independent. So where do we get the independent auditors, and how do we ensure that they don't come under pressure by the federal or state governments?
This is true. I mean, you do have people like the Australian Human Rights Commission are federally funded but are independent regulators. We have seen not very long ago where they were butting heads, where the Australian Human Rights Commission was quite critical of the federal government, and then federal government turned around and said, well, we're going to reduce your funding, and we're going to, I think they ended up introducing one of the new commissioners who was federally appointed as a way of sort of breaking up what they saw as being a group that were from their perspective, they thought the Human Rights Commission was being, I think, engaging politically, and the Human Rights Commission was looking at it saying, no, we're being independent, and we're a regulator, and we're here to tell the government that you're doing the wrong thing if you are doing the wrong thing, and they shouldn't have funding removed. But they did stick their heels in, and they did stay independent. So maybe if you had some regulators that were part of the NDIA and reporting to them, but also possibly also reporting to the Human Rights Commission or something like that. I mean, I don't know exactly what the structure would be, but you can have some level of independence, and you can have it where it's built into the structure of the group that they have a level of independence and are able to report to another organisation if that's not being maintained. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I was just big smile on my face then, so I was just remembering that movie with Sean Connery and Kevin Costner. You know, the FBI agents, the regulators, something they call themselves. They're going around and prohibition and that sort of thing. Look, if the Prime Minister wants an independent auditor, someone to lay down the, I'll do it. I'll do it. Pay me 100,000 a year, I'll do it. I'll make sure they're independent and don't bow down to anyone. I'm not scared of anyone. I've proven that time and time again. Now, where I live, I've been called an activist, troublemaker. I stand up and I speak my mind. I stand up for what I believe in. I think there's something wrong. I'll say I think there's something wrong. I'm not scared of doing it. Look, let's get these regulators, auditors, let's get them independent away from the government so they don't have to bow to whoever's in power at the time. Get them in there and audit the NDIA, audit the service providers, audit the people who are providing like Bright Sky and Affordability. I've been a member of them since 1991 and I've battled with them ever since. And I'm sick of them. And the only reason I stay with them is because I've got nowhere else to go. Audit those people, audit that organisation. They're useless. They're terrible at what they're doing. They're getting people who are in a vulnerable situation with their healthcare and their health needs, and they've made it 10 times worse. Oh, it's COVID's fault. Oh, we're so inundated. Oh, they've got a million reasons why they can't provide a service, but they're quite happy to take the money. Audit them. If the Prime Minister's ever going to listen to anyone outside their own circle, listen to this. Audit those organisations, audit yourself. Get someone in there who's not scared of you, the federal government, and not scared of the organisations, the big powerful ones. Get them in there. Get it done. Stop being so scared. It's pathetic. They just they make everyone jump through these hoops to ensure that it's providing proper services. The clients of the NDIS, they know if they're not getting the proper service. They'll speak up. If they don't do it to a support worker, they'll do it to a family member. So let's do it. So let's put pressure on the government to get an independent auditors or regulators or whoever you want to call it. Get them in there so they're not bowing down to the state or federal government or bowing down to the large organisation. Audit the organisation. They do something wrong, fine them big time. Make them pay for it. Make the NDIA pay for their mistakes. Now, I'm not anti-NDIA. I think the NDIA is great. I just think there's so many issues. There's so much inconsistency. There's so many cases of double dipping and triple dipping, quadruple dipping, like Chris said. He's got his, even I've done with my GP, my specialists, OTs, physios, all them people are being paid to tell you what the client's already told you 4 or 5 times. Open your ears, clean the wax out.
Well, maybe what do you think about the idea if you had the an independent regulator like the Disability Commissioner with the Australian Human Rights Commission, that they then become an overarching regulator that can then report on issues within the system? I mean, they'd be fairly well placed for it. But I mean, it's not really in their purview, but you could have someone like that who's connected with those organisations.
But there's no use getting an auditor in and to audit a service organisation or the NDIA, if they're going to get a month or 2 months notice, oh, we're going to come in, give you an audit, get your paperwork ready. So everyone wrestles around and gets their paperwork done.
That's right. Everyone gets dressed up in their Sunday best for the support sessions. They have, all the joyful music on and everyone dancing around having a good time. You need to have it so it's being spot checked. What about if you outsourced it? What do you think about privatisation, Jeff?
Privatisation of what, the NDIA? No.
No, not of the NDIA, but of auditors. So if you had independent auditors who were, private organisations who were paid to investigate these organisations and the government in their performance.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not something I've thought about. I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's a way of getting it. It means that the money is put aside by government at large, not by the NDIA itself, and then you could have people who are coming in and performing independent reviews of the system. You could have that headed up by often with these commissions, as you would with an ICAC. You have someone who's chosen by the government who should be relatively independent, hopefully, who can head up the team.
Yeah, we do need something like that system, but we need people in there who aren't going to, bow to pressure from governments. If they're going to do it, they need to be, ready to push back and not be afraid, of losing funding or from other pressures from the federal, state governments. It's a good idea. I think it needs to be done or looked into. I think there's more feedback that can be given to those types of organisations. I think that's a good idea. Someone who's not going to be scared of pushing back to the federal government.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. So, look, I had an email the other day from a person. I won't mention their name. I did get it. I am interested in those issues that you raised, but I just need you to give me a bit more information, just to expand on those points so I can look into it. If you could do that, that would be really good. So, thank you for those issues that you raised. I think that those topics that you raised are certainly relevant, but then I just need you to expand on them a little bit more, so I can get a better understanding and do a bit of research into it. But yeah, what time is it?
It's about, according to that, it's almost 11.
11. Yeah.
So,
Look, I don't want to sound like I'm whinging and whining about the NDIS. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to make things better. We need to do something, and that needs to be done soon. Otherwise, we might get the carpet pulled on the NDIS. I know it's been established for a few years, and the federal government might find it hard of closing the NDIS down, but they can certainly reduce the funding. So we just need to be careful, and try and save money where we can, not double and triple dip, and have that independent auditor, separate from the government. That would be good. I don't know what other people think. You can shoot me an email. Do you have anything else you want to talk about, Chris?
No, I think what you're saying is fairly relevant in the when you're talking about reducing wastage, reducing any sort of fraud, creating more equality with the way that things are spent, so that you can make sure that all people's needs are being generally met. I think all of these are really good things to do. It's also very easy to raise, and it can be very hard to regulate and enforce these things. But I think that that's a good approach, rather than I think previously the NDIA, when it was considered to be overspending, they were just looking at, oh, okay, let's try and not provide services or reduce the services. And this was the issue with my wife, is that they started saying, oh, well, the NDIA is overspent, so we need to spend less. Maybe I think that they were looking at getting rid of a hoist in our house. And they said, well, we needed that hoist so that she could get out of the chair. If she can't get out of the chair, then everything else is sort of a bit of a waste, really. It's sort of, and then we had to spend a lot of time arguing, justifying why we needed this hoist, given that she couldn't stand. It was just a ridiculous situation, and it was a waste of everyone's time, and what would have actually cost everyone more, because all of those people are working for the NDIA are getting paid, and all the people that we had there arguing on our behalf get paid as well. So yeah, just streamlining the process, I think, should be able to save a lot of money to start with, and then sort of take it from there. In terms of with the over 65s, how that works with being able to provide a consistency of support for people with disabilities when they turn 65. I think it's the way the system is working at the moment. It's just sort of head in the sand. I think that's what it comes down to, is that it's I don't know exactly what the system will be that works. I mean, maybe some sort of a hybrid between the two systems for people that have a disability but then are working, that then are over the age of 65, just so that they can have a continuity of support. But yeah, there's got to be some sort of a solution there.
See, I think it goes back to the days where people on the disability pension, regardless of the disability, on the disability support pension, once they turned 65, then they were transitioned over to the age pension. Now I know the blind disability support pension is a little bit different to that. When I first went on the pension, I was just on the normal disability support pension, or I only got half a pension because my wife was working, which is fair enough. That was a reasonable thing. I thought that, because my wife works, I don't get a full pension. That was fair enough. But when I progressed onto the blind DSP, then things changed. But we need to have a uniform system. I don't think, because I know years ago, if you're on the blind DSP, if you were single, you kept your full pension. If you had a job, you kept your wages plus the pension. But people who had a physical disability, if they found a job, they lost the DSP, which I thought was unfair. I think it should have been uniform right across. Now that's changed again since then with the blind DSP. I don't know how exactly it works now, but that's no longer the case. I don't think. Uniformity is key. I think there should be no differences if you're vision impaired or blind, or you have paraplegia, quadriplegia, cerebral palsy, intellectual disability. There should be no differences. It should be one system for everyone. If you allow people who are blind or vision impaired to keep their pension because they're single and they keep their wages, then that's not fair to those people with other disabilities who lose the DSP once they get a job. I'd never thought that was fair. But like I said, once people on the DSP turn 65, they'll transitioned over to the aged pension. Maybe that's an old system. Maybe it needs to be scrapped. Maybe it needs to be reviewed. Oh, what happened? We back? Okay. Yeah, so I don't know. How do we do this? I don't think it's fair that people on a physical disability transition to a age pension when they turn 65. I think that now with the NDIS, if you're on the NDIS before you turn 65, you're on it for life.
I think there's something else you raised there, Jack, which is very important. I think that it's just good in terms of maintaining the sustainability of any welfare system, as well as just having a good welfare ethic, and also it's also good for the mental health and well-being of the people on support systems. That if they work, that they're not penalised financially for it. I think that the more that you can be encouraging people to get out and work, because then they start paying taxes and they start contributing, and some of that money starts coming back. Because you need to be, the government. If someone's working, if they're a little bit less focused on recovering some of the money that they've given them, and more about encouraging them to go out and do more work, so that then they're going to be paying money back in the form of taxes instead, I think would be a much better way to go. And when you're talking about having that as part of that, with that welfare system, is encouraging people to get out. And if people are working, they tend to be much more mentally resilient. They tend to be socialising more. They tend to be going out and making more friends, and they improves their mental and physical well-being. So I think this would be a much better way to go for any of the welfare systems, whether it's for disability support or aged support or disability, or even disability support, or even unemployment benefits and things like that. The more that you can actually be incentivizing people to go out and do it. I know I know quite a few people who've on different types of benefits, who've said, I would go out and work more, but it's actually worth more to me if I don't. And then you go, well, there's something fundamentally wrong with the system where that's the case. You need to be encouraging people where they can, but not forcing them to. I mean, you don't want to have it so that people have to go out and do it, but if people can, then there's got to be a carrot there.
I think a good system would be to just sorry. I think a good system would be to encourage people with disabilities to go off the pension, to find work, but when I say go off the pension, stay on the pension, not get paid. But if something happens, then they can fall straight back onto the disability pension. And then when they're able to work again, then they transition back into work. They no longer get paid the pension money because they're earning a wage. But if things change, they've got that as a safety net to fall back on. And I know a lot of people over the last 30 odd years who wanted to work, but were scared that once they left the disability pension and got a job, that they would never get it back again, especially if they got sick. So I know, just for an example, paraplegics or quadriplegics, if they get pressure sores, they have to, it takes them months to years to get over pressure sores because the skin doesn't heal properly. Now, if you're working, then you're no longer getting that same income. But if you're fell back onto the pensions instead of sickness benefits, they'd feel more safe and secure. So I know that's been an issue for some people over the years, that they were scared to go transition from the DSP to working, lose the DSP, get sick again, or something happens, and they can no longer work, and they have a lot of trouble getting back on the disability support pension because they've already left it once. So
that's relapsing or remitting MS would be a similar case, I would imagine, where you can go extended periods of time, and then the next thing you're in a wheelchair, and going through a lot of grief. There'd be a lot of conditions that'll be like that, I would imagine.
Well, yeah. My interview with Cindy, she has progressive MS. I have MS on the relaxing remitting category. My symptoms aren't as severe as Cindy's, but um, she can go for periods of being able to, do things that she would normally do, and then something that it changes. It can change overnight, and she has trouble walking, or loses a balance, and yeah, those sort of situations. If they had a good safety net like the DSP to fall back on, I think that would be a good safety net. If they went from the DSP to work, then something happened, then they could go back to the DSP, and they know that you know then their supports are going to be there. So I don't know what other people's opinions are. Yeah, these are my opinions. These are what I've seen over the years, and from people I spoke to, and what I've witnessed myself personally with other people. It certainly is something for the government to look at. But
I
I
think
think
that
the NDIS was specifically designed for people who need those supports because of their disability. Um, I don't know.
I guess it's good to point. Like, it's good to reiterate what you were saying. It's not, it's easy to poke holes in things, but the NDIS is a good thing, and it has helped a lot of people, and it has, it's good to appreciate that it has some good aspects to it, but it could use some improvement, and it could, looking at people's experiences, there are some things where just a change in approach, something that actually doesn't require a lot of infrastructural change, could improve the efficiency of the NDIA. There's some people who've worked with the NDIA who have been really paying attention, who have a wealth of experience in the industry, and have been absolutely fantastic. So great, big shout out to those people. But when you're still having those experiences that are just frustrating, it creates a backlog. It's this bottleneck. It's an inefficiency that shouldn't be there, and it creates a huge amount of frustration. It's one thing that's really hard to be able to just communicate to other people who've had no experience in the field about how unbelievably frustrating it is every time that there's someone with a disability who's just trying to get to a goal, who's just trying to get to a certain point where they're each step along the way they're just facing all of these setbacks, and they're struggling often with whatever whatever disability they have, but they are on top of that, they're just trying to look for this funding, and they're getting pushback from people, and they're getting resistances that they shouldn't be getting. It's in areas where they should be trying to be getting supported, and they're just constantly filling out forms and constantly going to Centrelink, and they find Centrelink's made a mistake, and they've accidentally cut off their funding, and you need to go back in and you need to find out what the problem is, and then they don't know what the problem is, so they have to refer it to the people at the head office, and then they're not sure whether they're going to get paid next week or not. And then it's just this constant bureaucratic battle that a lot of people just end up giving up. They just throw their arms in the air. So the more that you can streamline that, the more you're saving money, you're streamlining the organisation, but also helping support the well-being of people with disabilities, because otherwise I've seen this lots of times, but they just give up. They just throw their arms in the air. They go, it's too hard.
Yeah, I'm the local peer support worker for Vision Australia in this area, and a couple of years ago I had a man roughly my age ring up, who was vision impaired, and his sight was getting worse. He was on the disability support pension, not the blind DSP, but the normal DSP. He reached out to someone for help, and they said, "Oh no, we can't help because you're not on the NDIS." And he said, "Well, what's that?" And he ended up calling me, and we had like a 2-hour telephone conversation about the NDIS and how it works and how good it is, and it'll support your needs. He didn't want to deal with it. It was too hard for him. He just, I gave him all these contacts for people to help him, and he never accessed any of them. So, yeah, so imagine how hard it is for someone with a newly acquired disability who's never had anything wrong, never had anything to do with a disability whatsoever in their lifetime, getting a disability and transitioning to the NDIS and the DSP. It's incredibly hard, incredibly hard. I found it frustrating for the first 3 years. Like I said in my previous stream, it was really hard. It was too hard, especially, um, by people who were supposed to help who weren't helping because they had the wrong information, because things have changed so much from when it first started. Like the government, when they wanted to try and save money, they brought out this rule that we won't fund everyday items. What's an everyday item? A phone. Okay, well, it's not just a phone for me. I have an iPhone. It's not just a phone for me. It's a multi-purpose tool. So for me, that's not an everyday item. If I was working, I wouldn't have an iPhone. I'd just have the cheapest mobile phone I could get. Talking microwave. A microwave's an everyday item, but I still needed an accessible one that spoke to me when I pressed the buttons. Smart TVs with parental controls. I think David Woodbridge spoke about this on one of his podcasts. TV is an everyday item, but a smart TV for a person who's blind or vision impaired is an everyday item, but it's also a tool.
But everyday items it's a very weird term within itself, Jeff, because if you've got someone who has limited mobility with their hands, then they'd have modified cutlery. For them, it's an everyday item. I mean, anything that people are using is an everyday item. If they refer to it as an unmodified item or something like that, would probably make more sense. An everyday item. I know when I first came across that term, I went, well, what does that mean? And it depends on how you use it. Like you say, that you've got an iPhone that you have as an everyday item. One of the things we didn't end up doing, but there was the possibility of having the eye tracking software, so that my wife would still be able to communicate, because she could look at the different letters on the screen and construct words, or it had phrases and things that you could construct. And I think that they were saying that there was no problem with the camera and the software that was loaded onto it, but it might have been possibly that the laptop that we were using, which was part of the whole package, was that considered an everyday item or not? And we had we didn't get any clear guidance on it. I think we were talking backwards and forwards with the NDIA about whether this was considered to be part of it. And they didn't know either, because they'd say, well, a computer, it's got all these peripherals that are plugged into it, but is that part of it, or is it a separate thing? It almost becomes this esoteric philosophical question about what's what. It'd be good if there was a bit more certainty about all of those things, about what an everyday item is. If you've got an iPhone, but you're using the iPhone for because you need to have an accessible device, and the other devices aren't as accessible as an iPhone is, you're using it so that you can You can track things, you can access things, you can take, when you find an unsafe piece of road, I know that you take photos of the unsafe piece of road so that you can send it to council. If you had another device, you probably wouldn't be able to do that. So if you didn't have that device, then your mobility would be extremely limited because of the way you use it, not whether it's an everyday item or not. It's a weird definition to make.
And that's the one definition the government used to save money. And I understand that there's a blowout. So I think the initial costing of the NDIS was going to be about 4 billion. So it's gone from 4 billion to what, 30 odd billion a year, which is, I think, the second highest costing for the federal government. The the everyday items, it's like you said, it's ambiguous. It's not a clear. It's not clear for the average person who's wanting something to help to be independent. So it is hard, but I think the more we talk about these things and the more it gets out there, the more it's discussed, and the more the government and the organisations are going to take notice.
I think that's possibly also a part of the blowout is you're looking at supports that were given to people. Sometimes those were covered by
Sorry.
they were they were relying on, like you say, there's volunteers, carers, supporters with church organisations and charities and that kind of thing before that have now perhaps they were pushed to the limit. Now they've taken a bit of a back foot as well. I think that you're right, that initial estimation of how much support would be needed to replace the existing systems, and that they were underfunded and they were stretched. So then, of course, once there is some funding to be had, then people are going to go, well, we want to be properly funded, we want to be properly resourced. But there's a limited amount of money, and the country can only afford a certain amount. It's a bit like aged care with the baby boomers population bubble, is that if it runs out of money, there's just not money. And then beyond working out efficiencies in the system, then they're going to start pulling back on the amount of money that they're giving people, which would be to be a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, well, I applied to get a computer a few years ago because the younger people may not remember this, but when we made phone calls, we were charged per minute, even through the landlines. You made a long distance phone call, you paid X amount per 3 minutes. So people didn't talk long because they couldn't afford it. Then computers came out, and then people were shooting off emails to family and friends, and wasn't costing me anything except the connection to the internet. Even the internet, when it first came out, you paid by the hour and how much data you used. Now it's you pay a flat fee and you get all this stuff, free unlimited calls for $40 a month. It's changed so much in my lifetime, and it's going to change again for the younger people now coming through. This is where we need consistency, not inconsistency. We need it. Everything needs to be unified, streamlined, and that's again. That's when the auditors come in, and that's when they start listening to the clients and people on the ground supporting people with disabilities. There's so much catch up from the government. By the time they catch up, technology's already leaped forward. I think last Streamfield talked about the Norcam glasses that had facial recognition and could read out documents. He was denied access to them, but he knew 3 other people who were accepted. So there's no consistency. There's more inconsistency. And that's where it needs to be streamlined. And having people on the NDIA, the staff who know nothing about a disability, making judgments on whether or not the person needs it or how they're going to use it, or that's not appropriate.
They're probably like a lot of people in the industry, Jeff, that are struggling to find good staff. It's hard to attract people into the industry. Or I think sometimes there's people who go into the industry with unrealistic expectations of what it's like. And maybe that needs to be improved. Or I think the government was talking about having, particularly in rural areas, of having free qualifications in disability support for people particularly in remote areas. And around here, it's hard to find good people who will do a good job. I mean, you want to make sure that there's a quality control there. If you're short staffed, you don't want to just be getting anyone through the door. You still want to be getting someone who's good at doing their job.
Oh, exactly. I mean, we tried to get people to come in and clean their house for years. We found over the years, I think 2, maybe 3 really good cleaners that did really good jobs. There was one young girl in her early 20s. She got into this because she wanted to help people with disabilities. She ended up moving to Newcastle because she felt like she wasn't being utilised for all of her skills that she had, all of her training at university. She was getting on her hands and knees and cleaning the floors and stuff like that. And like you said, Chris, people come in, especially young people, they come in that they're going to rescue people with disabilities and make the world better by snapping their fingers, and it's not realistic. I spoke to a manager of a service provider here in Armidale a few weeks ago, and we're talking about independent support workers, especially the young ones. And I said, they always come in thinking they're going to rescue the person with a disability and they're going to make their life so much better. They're going to be a hero to them, and have this unrealistic view of what their life's going to be like and the impact they have on their client. And that manager agreed. She had to dispel that so many times with new staff. You're not going to be a superhero. You're not going to change the world. You're there to support their needs. You're there to help them. That's your job. Whether it's personal care, whether it's taking them for coffee or to the movies or house cleaning, it's whatever the person needs. It's what you're required to do.
I guess there are two approaches to that too. Is that, I mean, I've always said to people, don't think that you can fix someone. If you've got someone, you've got a customer with an intellectual disability, you can't just sort of teach them and then they won't have an intellectual disability. They still have an intellectual disability, but you might show them how they can better support themselves. So I think this is certainly within flexible support. This is something that's a strong emphasis on people providing support in a way that is, it's sort of as a balancing act. On one hand, you don't want to be patronising, you don't want to be being paternalistic, but you want to be able to providing support to people who are helping them help themselves and helping them in ways that maybe means that then they can do something for themselves and have a greater level of independence. Getting support workers who can understand where that line is and where that balance is quite hard. It's a common complaint from customers and friends with disabilities is that they people come along and they end up being really talking down to the customer, or sort of speaking to them like they're a child, or they try and aren't you wonderful, you're such a strong person, and all this kind of thing that I think most people just find very patronising and very gag worthy. Or the other thing is coming in and saying, well, there's someone who needs help, so just come in and help them, rather than looking at how you can help them to achieve what they want to do. It's just leaping in first and doing everything for them, which is not what you want either. But it's a balancing act there. Everyone's different as well. It's a matter of open communication and talking to them as people.
And I agree. And one of the discussions I've had recently is, independent workers, especially the young people, working for themselves, as a support worker. I think they need to have the same policies and procedures for themselves as an organisation does. If they get sick, are they going to get someone to replace them, or do they just ring up their client and say, "I can't provide supports today"? That's not appropriate, and that needs to be addressed by the NDIA as well. These independent workers, they need to have the same um, requirements and regulations that service providers have, like the proper insurance, who you're going to get to replace you if you go on holidays, if you go off sick, because you just can't go up to a person and say, "I'm not providing support for the next week, I'm having a week off." What's the person going to do? They can't reach out to another service organisation because you don't have a support agreement with them. So that the NDIA needs to look into that too for independent support workers. Make sure they have the same policies and procedures and requirements as service organisations. It's pretty important, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. There have been some independent workers have been pulled over the coals for that, or they've just had no evidence at all. They don't do any notes. They don't have any policies and procedures or anything formal in place. You're right, it can be a real problem.
Yeah, there's no first aid qualifications like CPR, all that sort of stuff. So that needs to be addressed by the NDIA, and I think they are currently doing that, which is great. So good on you for the NDIA for that. That's well done. You're looking outside the scope a little bit. But yeah, I don't know. Just with the over 65s, yeah, if anyone wants to have an input, send an email or come up into the chat. I think we have the link pinned up above the chat box there.
Yes, we do. We've got the link pinned up there. So anyone can access that if they want to have a look at it, or you can leave a comment. So you may be watching this as a recording, have to leave a comment, or I guess if there's anything else that needs to be raised.
Yeah, I might do a instructional video on how to leave a comment, how to go through YouTube, especially when someone's going live. I might do an instructional video. I go to a person, her name's Silver Diamond. She has her own chat panel. She's really good. It's a place where people go to talk about different things and have a bit of fun, a bit of a laugh at each other. It's great. And yes, that is her real name, Silver Diamond. So check her out. She's great. You hit that link and just follow the steps, and you'll go up into what they call the green room or the basement, and the person who's running the channel will see you there, and they'll click on you and bring you up into the chat, and you can start talking. So it's once you click that link, it's I think two or three steps. Then you go to the basement, then you get brought up into the chat. So I might do an instructional video on it over the next week or two. I don't have anything else to mention. Do you want to say anything, Chris? Or
No, I think we've covered the topic fairly fairly thoroughly, and my tongue's gone numb now.
What do they call it? Cotton mouth, and it goes dry and you get tongue tied. I do it all the time. I get tongue tied, so I know the feeling. All right, so we might leave it there. I don't think anybody wants to come up into the chat. So we might just leave it there and call it quits. And I will stream every Wednesday at 9:30. I'll have different topics. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to try to look into the mental health for people with disabilities and the old taboo subject, sex. Sex. That's all you ever think about, as they say in the Monty Python movies. So we might just leave it there for till next week. But yeah, thanks for looking in. Right.